Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. For those of you watching on Paramount Plus and CBS News 24/7, welcome back to our studios here in the Washington, D.C. Bureau of CBS News. We're going to peer into the future this week, ladies and gentlemen, not economically, although partially economically, mostly foreign policy and national security. And we're going to do that with someone who I've gotten to know, and I spend a lot of time reading the magazine that he is the editor-in-chief of, that magazine, Foreign Policy, the editor-in-chief, Ravi Agrawal. Ravi, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Such a pleasure.
So let's start with a place you know well. In your career, you spent a fair amount of time in India and analyzing geopolitics from the prism, if you will, of Asia. Let's start there. The Trump administration incoming, China, and the regional concerns. Broadly, how do you evaluate them? What kind of flashpoints should my audience be paying attention to?
So China is the main prism within the Asian prism, I think, that determines a lot of US policy in the region. Everyone is going to be looking out to see, first off, whether the Trump administration puts in place bigger tariffs on China. Trump has mooted as much as 60%. If he goes ahead with that, you can imagine that the markets will react very strongly. It would be very disruptive to global trade, to supply chains, and many things indeed would need to change to accommodate that kind of those rates of tariffs. For other countries, I think it's a different game because, if it's a flat 20% tariff on other countries, they would each try to seek their own way of dealing with a Trump administration. So that's one way of imagining in the early weeks of the Trump era, how Asian countries will be looking out for signals to see how things might affect them. More broadly, however, Asia now has a number of swing states, countries like India, countries like Indonesia, that increasingly don't want to be aligned too closely with the United States, even though they are, relatively tilting towards the United States, and they want to keep their options open with even China. India is key among those countries in that it had a long-standing border dispute with China, and it recently resolved, or says it has resolved, that dispute. And there are many potential reasons why that's the case. But one reason could well be that, India wants to hedge its bets, especially as they see a new administration in DC.
A couple of issues for China. One, I've read that it has tried to make it less export dependent economically. There have been some rocky roads trying to attempt that. Secondly, the other issue, of course, between the United States and China is the fate and future of Taiwan. And the experience in Hong Kong is not promising for the Taiwanese, at least in terms of political repression. Evaluate those two things, how China is trying to make itself less export driven and had problems with that, and its ongoing, let us say, stressing out of Taiwan.
Yeah, those are two very important factors here. So, over the last 8 years or so, basically since 2016, China's reliance on the US has decreased. The percentage of its exports going to the United States has decreased in large part because of the first round of Trump tariffs on China. And so that reduced dependence, interdependence as well, I should say, accelerated post-pandemic as countries began to try and nearshore, friendshore, all of these terms that people in our field use, and companies as well began to try to have less of their supply chains be dependent on China. As all of that has accelerated, then any U.S. action on China is, less impactful because there's less to impact by definition. And it's interesting that you brought up Taiwan alongside this because the two are linked in many ways. China has stated that it wants to be ready to try and attack Taiwan by 2027. I emphasized be ready because that doesn't mean it will do so. It just means that the instructions to the army have been to try and be ready. And the strategy on the part of the West has long been to try and raise the costs for a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So to make it so difficult militarily, economically, And not just that, but also strategically, if, for example, the Chinese see that, Russia trying to annex Ukraine didn't work out so well for it because of global pressure, then maybe it should think twice about Taiwan. So much of the US strategy is going to hinge on those two things. How much stick to deploy in terms of tariffs, how much to try and ensure that China isn't able to develop the kinds of high-tech semiconductors that the United States wants to have, sort of to capture that market. And then lastly, how much the United States can try and deter China from acting on Taiwan. All of this is going to be a focus for the next administration, but there are, degrees of difference between how the Trump administration will approach it and how the Biden administration did.
You mentioned near shore, friend shore. Apple doesn't do that. My work device, because I have no other choice, is an iPhone. Apple has almost all of its iPhone manufacturing still in China, if I understand it correctly. And they're an enormous player in the US economy and the global economy. Not that Apple itself is a separate negotiating partner with China, but it's not irrelevant to any president's calculations about what consumers in America do or don't get, at what price they get it, and a large multinational corporation.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. But again, I mean, even Apple has been diversifying. It is investing heavily in India, for example, where it's been trying to open factories and has long been in talks with India's government to try and adhere to India's fairly strict labor laws and the subsidies that go in place when foreign companies try to manufacture in India. So to sort of align with what the government wants as well. Apple has been looking to diversify. There's also Tesla, right, which
Yep.
has significant operations in China. And when you look at the closeness of Elon Musk with President-elect Donald Trump right now, then one has to wonder whether China, in a sense, has some leverage over the United States and over Trump simply because of that relationship. So there are many, many sort of three-dimensional chess aspects to how the next administration will have to deal with any sanctions, any tariffs on China. But the question is what signals they will look for as, there's resistance. Are the
Mm-hmm.
signals going to be protests from individual CEOs, companies?
Right.
Is it going to be market signals? We all know Trump loves watching the stock markets.
Yeah.
So we don't know what the checks and balances are.
Indeed. And very quickly with China and Tesla, China has not cornered the electric vehicle market, but is a significant global player, particularly in cost per unit. And the highest tariffs being levied against anything in China right now are by the Biden administration over electric vehicles.
Yeah, exactly. And those could actually go up even further. I mean, so the Trump team had proposed tariffs as high as 200% on Chinese electric vehicles, which, again, would severely restrict, make it impossible for them basically to try and sell in the United States and affiliated countries. This, of course, there is a contradiction here as well, because Chinese electric vehicles, BYD, for example, a company that prolifically sells electric vehicles, they're much cheaper.
Yes.
And there are many countries in Asia and even in Europe, for example, which will say, wait a minute, if we kind of want to double down on clean energy, shouldn't all of us be using these very cheap electric vehicles? So there are contradictions. There always have been, I think, in US policy, in the Biden administration's foreign policy, as there will be in a Trump administration's foreign policy.
The voice of Ravi Agrawal, who was the editor in chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Segment two of the Takeout will focus on Russia and Ukraine. Back in a second.
The question is, what will America be willing to tolerate in terms of what Ukraine has to give up?
Welcome back to the Takeout. Just in case you're curious, yes, I am a subscriber to Foreign Policy, and we have the editor in chief, Ravi Agrawal, here with us. Ravi, let's talk about Russia and Ukraine. In the month of November, which, as we are talking, is nearly over, a deeply consequential month in the understood battle space. The Biden administration, after much internal debate and external pressure, made two decisions. One, to allow a particular long range missile device, ATACMS is what they're called, to be used by Ukraine into Russian territory, and allowing Ukraine to deploy anti personnel mines. Russia, in kind, didn't unleash a full blown intercontinental ballistic missile, but something with that technology adjacent that could carry a battlefield nuclear weapon if Russia were so inclined. It isn't, but that is part of their doctrine. And in case anyone was curious, Russia made clear that, yes, it is still part of the doctrine and being viewed, let us say, with more intensity in the month of November. What does this tell you broadly about where this is heading? Is this both sides trying to prepare for a settlement, or both sides escalating to an oblivion we can't even contemplate?
It could be a bit of both. You put all of that very well in terms of the dynamics. But I think for the Biden administration, this is a last gasp. They are doing everything they can do before they're no longer in office. And one consistent criticism of how they've approached the war in Ukraine, at least by Europeans and supporters of Ukraine, is that the Biden administration has routinely been asked for X or Y weapon. They've said, no, we can't do it. We shouldn't do it for P or Q reasons. And then three months later, they change their minds and they say, okay, here you go. Here's the thing that you asked for, except 3 months have gone by and a lot of damage has been done. And the Ukrainians say, well, if we had this earlier, we could have saved many lives. We could have done a lot more. Now, you could apply that criticism once again to the ATACMS that you mentioned. Ukraine has been asking for these for more than a year now. Part of this was coordinated, I think, with the British government when Prime Minister Keir Starmer came to Washington a couple of months ago. And around about then, Biden was also in talks with Zelensky to try and game out what it would mean if those long-range missiles were given to Kyiv. So Britain has also given Storm Shadow, which is the British version of the ATACMS you mentioned, and Kyiv is looking to also use those. Now, part of Kyiv's point in all of this has always been that Russia is always going to say it will escalate more and more if we escalate. So Russia, in a sense, is bluffing, is their point, because what more could Russia do? What more could it possibly do to hurt Ukrainians and other people? And the answer is it could do more. It could launch a nuclear device. And the thing that everyone has been trying to game out is that the chance of that may be extremely low. Putin wants you to think it's high, but even if the chance is 0.0001%, are you willing to take that chance? And that is the game of chicken that Putin has now been playing for, almost 3 years and continues to do that. And I think the incoming Trump administration is going to have to deal with the same set of dynamics until they are able to broker some sort of a peace deal.
Right. And the big fear in Ukraine is that peace deal is no you trade some end of hostilities for territory that the Russians occupy, but we're not going to really worry about your ability to defend yourself. We're not going to really worry about our ability to provide you weapons. So you will be a weakened, intimidated, near vassal state of Russia, with a thin veneer of sovereignty. But it'll be over and I'll be a peacemaker. That's Kyiv's fear.
That is a valid fear. They have every reason to fear that outcome. On background, they are increasingly realistic about the fact that this can't go on forever the way
Some
that
territory is going to have to be ceded, and it's about what you cede it for and how permanent are the concessions you receive from Russia and how enforceable they are.
Exactly. And both sides have maximalist red lines, maximalist positions on this. And that's how negotiations work.
Right.
You start from a maximalist position and then you give some up. The question is, what will America be willing to to tolerate in terms of what Ukraine has to give up? And crucially, within all of this, what will Trump see as a win? I think from what we understand of President-elect Trump, he doesn't like losing. He has criticized Biden, for example, for the way in which the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. Um, Trump focuses on imagery. He will not want a similar moment of defeat when it comes to Ukraine. So if you can imagine then that some sort of a deal is struck where Ukraine holds on to the 80-odd% of territory that it currently controls, Russia gets to annex the 18 to 20% odd amount of territory that it controls. If something like that happens, the question then is who protects the territory that Ukraine does have? Now, is it NATO, which will be unacceptable to Putin? Is it Europe, which is NATO minus the United States and Canada? What version of that ends up being the deal that is struck is anyone's guess. But
Right.
here's the thing, you only approach negotiations from a position of strength. And I think one of the things Kyiv is worried about is the perception that Trump just wants this to end quickly. And when you're impatient about something ending, you usually end up striking a deal that isn't as good as it could be.
Right. Let's just say where Russia is, Russia gets. But what about that border, wherever that border is drawn? Is it Ukrainians who are defending that? Is it international peacekeepers? And if it's international peacekeepers, from where are they drawn? Under what are their rules of engagement? Would even Moscow accept that? Because Ukraine, after having lived through this trauma and this death and destruction, has to have some sort of assurance that a ceasefire or a resolution of this doesn't leave it in perpetual jeopardy.
It does. It is going to ask for that. And the question again is who coughs up the money,
Right.
who coughs up the army to do all of those things. And Ukraine is very depleted. They're going to need help. There's one more element to this, Major, and that is sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty that the United States has been trying to point to for 2.5 years now. Do borders matter? Does sovereignty matter? And, if, for example, Russia gets to end up with 20% of what has been Ukraine's territory, then what does it say to other countries that are looking to try and do something similar? And with what standing and with what face can the United States or the rules-based liberal international order say, that's not allowed. We don't let these things happen, yet we do.
And in our minute 30 in this segment, Ravi, let's go back to Asia because North Korea is a player in this now. China has been a player. What are their interests in Russia and Ukraine?
My own sense is that each of them has different motivations. We make too much sometimes of what is known as the quartet of chaos, Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea, in that it's a marriage of convenience rather than some sort of clear, defined sense of affirmative vision for what they want to do. I think what we do understand that they each want is to chip away at American influence and power and American allies. And so to that end, in as much as America has backstopped or tried to backstop Ukraine along with NATO and European allies, then obviously China wants to try and chip away at that effort, as does North Korea, as does Iran.
And for better or for worse, time will tell, Putin is a available, flexible instrument in that process.
He is indeed, and he has been a known mischief maker in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, as we've been discussing. And he is always looking for allies of convenience, allies who can step in where needed without needing to have a broader agreement on vision or values or morals, which, with the Biden administration, you'll remember everything was framed as democracies versus autocracies, which is a binary. Putin doesn't need those kinds of definitions.
He does not indeed. The voice of Ravi Agrawal, who is the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. He mentioned the quartet of chaos. Iran is in there. Iran in the Middle East. Segment 3 coming your way in just 1 second.
Inasmuch as Iran had a forward defense force of sorts that it was using to point a gun at Israel, that is gone.
Welcome back to the Takeout. It's great to have you with us, coming to you from our bureau in Washington, D.C., our little studio here on the third floor. Ravi Agrawal is our guest, editor-in-chief, Foreign Policy Magazine. So, Iran, Israel, and the broader Middle East. I read in your magazine very recently that Iran is now backing away from its long-running proxy strategy, relying on or using for its reliance to exert influence in the region, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi rebels in Yemen, and is now thinking and structuring itself much more on a one-to-one direct confrontation with Israel. What does that mean for the region and for the incoming Trump administration?
Well, first of all, Iran may not have had much of a choice here. Hamas
Maybe
is
not. Maybe
decimated.
not.
Hezbollah is completely decimated. Their leaders have been killed, and these groups may regenerate. We all know that a variety of militia groups, terrorist groups, can often regenerate when their leaders are decapitated. But in this case, both organizations are really severely decimated. So, in as much as Iran had a forward defense force of sorts that it was using to point a gun at Israel, that is gone. And so it has no choice now to think of this as a more direct conflict, keeping in mind that many previous red lines where the two countries would never acknowledge that they directly attack each other, but they have done so. They've crossed those red lines
Yep.
publicly, admittedly, this year. So all of that changes and takes us to this sort of moment where, things are more tense than they have been in decades. And really, at this point, with Iran as weakened as it is, with a relatively new president in place, um, one of the things Israel is gaming out is whether this is a good moment to attack Iran further, to maybe go as far as even taking out Iranian nuclear installations, which would be a very, very complicated maneuver. It is not something Israel can do on its own. It requires either American bombs and planes or American assistance directly. But that is currently what is being discussed in some circles, or at the very least being advocated in the arena of ideas.
And Ravi, I know the answer to this, but I want you to put it in your own words. Explain to my audience why it's so difficult to get at Iran's nuclear facilities.
Well, they are spread out. There are several of them. They are deep in some cases, deep into uh, mountainous areas, many, many thousands of feet underground. And so to get to them, you need very specific, high impact, heavy bombs that can penetrate the ground deep enough and then blow up these installations. Again, when you do these things, you don't want to do them in a way that inflicts some damage but doesn't achieve the outcome it was meant to achieve. So you need very specific types of weaponry that Israel currently, we're told, does not have on its own. The United States does. So it would either need all of that weaponry, and then there are some who will say it also needs American planes and assistance to be able to provide air cover, to be able to get in and out safely.
And that is going to be something this incoming Trump administration is going to have to weigh, it seems to me, Ravi, within the first year or two.
Oh, absolutely, because this is a live debate. Now, it's interesting that the Trump administration has to weigh this question because there are a range of factions within Trump's orbit that see this in very different ways. There is a faction that really has been looking for an opportunity to bomb Iran, that has been looking for an opportunity to take out its nuclear weapons, maybe go as far as regime change.
Mm-hmm.
For that group, for that faction, this moment is the moment to strike. The time has finally arrived. There is another faction in Trump's orbit that is quite influential, that believes that the United States should not embroil itself in foreign wars. And this is a strand of thinking that is quite popular in the United States, left and right, frankly, even among military families. This notion that why should we spend more blood, sweat, and tears anywhere else in the world when we need to invest at home? Now, which of these two strands, these two arguments, these two visions are going to win out? A lot of that depends on who has Donald Trump's ear finally on this. both domestically but also internationally. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, is obviously going to try and ask Trump to go with the first option, which is to help Israel go all the way and bomb Iran.
And let's talk about Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Gaza. In your magazine, there are a number of stories about the humanitarian suffering in Gaza and how it is on a precipice. It's been bad for many, 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 many months, but it is on a kind of famine, disease precipice that is not just alarming, but potentially catastrophic. Israel and its government have received no shortage of criticism for allowing this to happen, for using it as a sort of tool of warfare. How should we think about that going into the new year?
You put it well. It is a catastrophe. It already is. The people of Gaza have gone through a lot, unimaginable losses of lives, hunger. They are on the cusp of famine, if not already there. The winter rains are going to arrive soon, which will bring with it flooding, disease, waterborne diseases like typhoid. This is going to get a lot worse. It is still very, very difficult to get aid into Gaza. Aid groups are struggling to do the work that they do. Journalists are routinely targeted within Gaza as well. Foreign journalists, I should point out, can't even get in anymore.
Right.
So it is extremely dire. And in as much as there are many day zeros you can think of in this conflict, you can go back decades, you can
Yes,
go
you
back
can.
to October 7 last year. But one of the things I felt about this is that any reasonable human being has to be able to say that October 7 was just awful. It was horrific. And what is also happening right now in Gaza is horrific. And whichever side of the broader Israel-Palestinian debate you fall under, it should be possible for all of us to agree that what has happened and is happening in both these places has been and is awful. And the world needs to do a lot more than it is doing to stop the fighting.
Yes, in this instance, and there's a long history of it in the region, barbarity has begotten more barbarity. It's just the fact.
Yeah, exactly. And the cycle needs to stop. Of course, that cycle has been perpetuated in Lebanon as well, thanks to Hezbollah, you could say, but also, again, similar critiques aimed at Israel for not doing more to protect civilian populations. And I think Israel also needs to bear in mind that it was put in a very, very complicated position of feeling an existential sense of danger and needing to protect itself, but then also that the actions it has taken since then have cost it immense amounts of soft power globally, where a number of countries now are increasingly pointing the finger at it, calling what it is prosecuting in Gaza a genocide. The Saudis, MBS, the leader of Saudi, recently said that what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. So the longer this goes on, the harder it is for countries in the Arab world, but also well beyond that, to support Israel, to stand up for it when it needs standing up for. And then also any of the normalization deals, which we've been discussing of extending to Saudi Arabia, become that much harder to accomplish when they're calling each other out for war crimes.
And all of this will land on President Trump's lap when he takes office in January. There is a sense, Ravi, and I'll throw this out there, and you can pick it up on the other side of our break, that Trump is more or less, because he talks to Benjamin Netanyahu with some frequency, that's established on the record, that he has basically told the Israeli prime minister, when I come in, I want you to wrap this up. Whatever you're intending to do, get about it quickly, because I want to have this resolved in some sort of resolvable way by the time I'm president. You can respond to that on the other side of this break. Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy Magazine, segment 4, coming your way in just 1 second.
If it were that easy, if the United States had all of this leverage to exercise on Netanyahu, why didn't it do it earlier?
Welcome back to the Takeout. Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, is our guest. So I laid that out. Trump basically telling Netanyahu, get about it.
Well, there are two ways of looking at this. One is that if it were that easy, if the United States had all of this leverage to exercise on Netanyahu, why didn't it do it earlier? So what was the Biden administration missing that they couldn't do it? Of course, the Biden administration will say it didn't have any leverage at all.
Yeah.
Despite all the arms it sends and the aid it gives to Israel and the way it backstops Israel militarily in the region, but U.S. officials have said they are not able to actually influence Netanyahu's actions the way they would like, no matter how much frustration they show. So it really is a test for Trump. If he is able to impose his will on Netanyahu, then that means the Biden administration had failed to do so, despite
Right.
having the means to do so.
And it also might mean get it over with, could mean just about anything, things that previous administrations would never have greenlit, might be greenlit by Trump. Go over and take back the West Bank, as some of your most ardent members of your right-wing cabinet want to do in Israel. Reoccupy Gaza, basically bulldoze whatever you want to bulldoze and take it on in whatever capacity you think provides you security.
And that's the second point I was going to make. So that is the other consideration here, which is real. And if you look at some of President-elect Trump's appointments, Mike Huckabee, for example, as U.S. ambassador to Israel, he has said that there is no such thing as a Palestinian. Then you have to imagine that we could be entering an environment where whatever little humanitarian concerns the Biden administration had and was able to influence the Netanyahu government on, all of that might be off the table. And you could see a very different outcome than the Biden administration was at least imagining or trying to push for, however unsuccessfully.
And language matters sometimes. And Robbie, you and I had this conversation on a recent episode of America Decides. Mike Huckabee doesn't even use West Bank. He says
He,
Samaria and Judea.
that's exactly right. The biblical terms.
What does that mean? What does that convey? How that might shape policy?
Well, in a sense, it conveys that this was always Israel's and no
Yeah,
one else's.
right.
And that's the end of the debate. And once you frame it in biblical terms, it's really hard to argue against it. Then it becomes a question of religion and land that has been bestowed and always been in that way. Then that's debate over. Whether or not the people living there or with claims to land there, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, indeed. I want to touch on a couple of things before we have to wrap up. One, energy in the future as it flows through geopolitics, as it flows through AI, as it flows through how the power centers see one another, how Europe deals with Russia, how Asia deals with the United States. What are your thoughts?
That's a huge question. I'm going to try and offer a few
I know. I apologize.
a few interesting things I can summon. So one is when Russia's war in Ukraine ends, let's say it ends at some point in 2025, it'll be very interesting to see whether sanctions on Russian oil get lifted and what that means in terms of where the oil goes. So right now, for example, much of Russia's oil goes to China and India. India, by the way, refines Russian oil, and some of it ends up in Europe anyway, which no one likes to talk about, but it is true.
Yep.
But the question is, if Europe refuses to buy Russian oil in the future, is that the model? I mean, is India going to refine it? Are other countries going to refine it? What happens to the global oil markets when Russian sanctions are lifted is a very interesting topic for 2025. The second thing is, Trump believes in drill, baby, drill. America is already the world's biggest oil producer. You can imagine that that could increase still further.
And liquefied natural gas also.
Exactly. You add all of that up, and then, the price at the pump in the United States will be quite low for much of 2025. What that also means then for supply and demand for other big oil producers, with oil prices low, That means countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, countries that rely on oil, will be getting a lower amount of money for what they're producing. That has a range of global implications. And then the last thing I'll say is, we're all very focused on AI. And one of the things that AI and the semiconductor industry is very focused on is energy. The amount of compute power that the increased use of AI and semiconductors has taken up in cloud computing is, the size of a reasonably, big economy at this point.
Right.
Something like 3 to 4% of the total global energy usage is now going towards AI and, high level computing activities, crypto mining and the like. Where is that energy going to come from? So if we all assume the baked in growth for AI over the next 5 years at the rates that everyone thinks they will grow at, then where does that energy come from? And there's a big conversation going on about what sources of energy you're going to need, whether it's nuclear, because wind and solar aren't going to cut it. It's
Nope.
intermittent supply. You need harder, more consistent sources of energy. And then you begin to look around the world. Where is that going to come from? Are you going to have to strike deals once again with the Middle East to
Hmm.
see if they can set up the plants you need for the energy that AI requires? Or is it going to be somewhere further afield? Fascinating discussion to see play out.
And it seems to me, Ravi, that 4 years from now, cryptocurrency and artificial intelligence are going to be embedded into every conversation about geopolitics and global economics,
Oh,
if they
absolutely.
aren't already. But I mean,
If
for
they
the
aren't
common
already.
person, not the trader, not the executive, not the C-suiter, but everybody.
Absolutely. It's already underway. I think, especially with AI, in a use case that regular people can already see on their phones with various apps that they use. It's very tangible what AI can do and where it's headed. And I think the big moment for that was generative AI and the sort of the chat GPT revolution, where people first began to see how large language learning models work. Um, I am not so much of a bull on cryptocurrencies. I think that in many senses they had declined over the last year or so. Trump's reelection has given several cryptocurrencies a real shot in the arm. But personally, I don't quite understand the longer term use case scenario for it in a mass way, the way I do for AI.
Right. Central banks either are or aren't going to recognize digital currencies, and there's an intense regulatory and economic debate underlying that. That's going to be a conversation for another time. Ravi Agrawal, the editor in chief of Foreign Policy Magazine. Sir, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And folks, stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial. That is next.
I am an oldie. I still listen to the Dire Straits and Oasis and Fleetwood Mac. My wife doesn't let me listen to that.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. For those of you watching on Paramount Plus and CBS News 24/7, thanks for hanging out with us. Welcome back to our Washington, D.C. studios on Zoom with Ravi Agrawal, who is the editor in chief of Foreign Policy. So we have three questions we ask a lot of our guests, almost all of them. Ravi, take them in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? All-time favorite movie or one of your all-time favorite movies? And if you're on a long flight or a long drive, what kind of music that you really, really love are you most likely to listen to?
Wow, these are great questions. It is probably a good thing you didn't give them to me ahead of time. So let me do this. You said in any order, so here
Yes.
goes. My all-time favorite movie is actually an Italian film. It's called Cinema Paradiso.
Oh, of course,
Uh,
I know it well.
And it's just fantastic for so many reasons. But most of all, for me, it's about leaving home. And it's about what you give up, the trade-offs when you
Yeah.
leave home. Most people around the world have left a home somewhere and moved somewhere, whether it's down the road, whether it's another continent. And something is gained and something is lost. And I think that movie just beautifully depicts both of those things in a way that I think anyone of any age can really appreciate. It's in Italian and subtitled, of course. I don't speak Italian or understand it, but boy, what a beautiful movie it is. I watched it when I was, I think, 14, and it has stayed with me ever since. Um, on books, so many, but I will point to a book of fiction. This one is by the Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul. Naipaul is of Indian extraction, grew up in the West Indies, the Caribbean, and then ended up in the UK in his later years. The book that he wrote that affected me the most is a book called A House for Mr. Biswas. And it is a profound book on so many levels. It is able to take on concepts of shame and guilt and hope and ambition in a way that is so raw and so powerful, and so sensitive to the three cultures and lands and continents that Naipaul straddles. And as someone who also straddles different lands and cultures, it's something that really spoke to me. I admire his writing. I also think was a very complicated person, deeply flawed in many respects, but that made his work all the more interesting. Last question was music. Honestly, when I drive, it is mostly with my wife. I am an oldie. I still listen to the Dire Straits and Oasis and Fleetwood Mac. My wife doesn't let me listen to that anymore if I'm with her. So when we're on a long drive together, it's usually top 40. She loves top 40. I love top 40 as well. For her, it's just jiving to a great song. For me, I'm learning something new. What's not to like?
You'll always get a receptive audience with me when you mention Dire Straits, and those three answers near the top of all the answers ever given on this show. Ravi Agrawal, it's been a pleasure, sir. Thanks so much.
Pleasure's all mine.
We'll see you next week, folks.